What was child psychology like, and what were the trends in psychology overall in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s? We'll find out next in this interview with Dr. Brian Macdonald on Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. Well, hey everyone, we're about to go to an interview with Dr. Brian Macdonald. And before we get to that interview, I just really wanted to tell you how much I appreciate everything you're doing for me here on this channel, all the likes, the comments, the subscribers, and really encourage you to keep it up. I'm really dedicated to bringing good material to you and interesting material of, growing up Generation X, and I hope you like it. So please, if you like what we're doing here on the channel, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share it on your favorite social media. If you're listening to this on the podcast form, please don't forget to leave us an honest review, leave us a rating, and also share it on your favorite social media. And if you are listening to this on podcast form, just remember we've got a YouTube channel as well, and there are some video exclusives over on that YouTube channel. But today on the program, we're going to be talking about those psychological trends and what children went through as they grew up, Generation X, and what the psychologists thought about the best way to raise children and the best way to help children during that time. So enjoy this interview. Now to the interview with Dr. Brian Macdonald. Hey everyone, this is ENC. You are listening to Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. I am super excited about what we got going on today. We got a personal friend of mine, Brian Macdonald. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing great, Ian. Thanks for having me on.
I've been looking forward to this actually since we contacted each other through Facebook. Brian actually has a PhD, is that right? Or is it a PhPSY?
It's a PhD.
PhD in child psychology. And today we are going to be talking about the development of child psychology through Generation X, basically kind of through the 70s, through the 80s, and through the 90s. Maybe a little bit about what we're going to be about today, but not too much. We're going to kind of keep it in that general frame. So, Brian, but first of all, before we get into some of these heavier questions, tell me a little bit about yourself. When did you get your doctorate? What was your dissertation? That kind of thing. What got you into child psychology? Wherever you want to start with that bag of worms.
Wow. Oh, some hard questions. I don't need notes for this part, at least, because I remember what happened. I did my master's and PhD at the University of Ottawa. And when I started that program, my plan was to become a couples counselor or a marriage counselor. And my initial research project and some of the papers that I wrote early on were focused on adult marriage counseling as opposed to the work that I do now, which is with kids. My dissertation was on self-silencing and its impact on depression in marital relationships. And
okay. Wow. Very interesting.
Yeah. So I at the time, because I finished my degree in 2000, and at that time, some statistical software was starting to become more commonly used, and I was able to do causal modeling, which was fairly new for my colleagues in the program. So I had to develop a model, and it meant that the book that I wrote was a little bit shorter, maybe than some of my friends' books, because I had a model to work from instead. Which though changed, because over time in doing my practical training, I started working with teenagers, and I enjoyed that work so much. I worked in a mental health promotion and awareness agency as a student, and I just loved it. And it seems like the people that I work with have kept getting younger and younger ever since. I felt like I found a calling, and I just enjoyed it so much. So after finishing my degree in 2000, since then I've worked in mental health treatment centers for kids. I've worked as a school psychologist. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a school psychologist when I started
Right.
studying to become a psychologist. So I've worked in schools. I've worked as a clinical supervisor at the University of Ottawa, where I went to school. So training students to do assessments primarily. And now I'm full time in private practice, where I focus on supporting kids with learning problems. The majority of my practice is assessment and diagnosis of learning difficulties, giftedness too, but for the most part, learning difficulties like ADHD or learning disabilities.
Well, you would have loved if I was in your, if, if I was a kid now, we would have had a great time because I have a learning disability. I'm extremely dyslexic, and it took me a long time to learn to read, and it's still very difficult for me to read. People are always surprised that I actually earned a doctorate because it was so hard for me to read. I'm kind of glad that I earned a doctorate in this time where you have the internet and you have like lots of YouTube videos. But I did a little trick whenever I would find, like, whenever there's a book assigned to me, this is just a little trick that I did. I would go out and try to find the lectures that that person did or the book on tape or both. Because normally, if you have somebody who did, wrote a book and it was assigned to you in class, that author had done the lecture circuit. And so you could kind of get an idea of what they talked about through the book. And of course, it'd make reading the book much easier because then I would, listen to the lectures and then go, yeah. But so I understand dealing with learning disabilities as well. So my wife, actually, where we are right now is a school, and she actually deals with a lot of kids with learning disabilities. So
Oh,
yeah, she was actually very interested in this interview because I was just like, oh, I'm going to be talking to somebody about, child psychology. And she's been working with children for, oh God, I mean, since we met. She's been working with children since we met through daycare and now through education and stuff like that. So very interesting. So let's get started on this because, look, I know that as I grew up, I became very aware real quickly that my mother, who raised me, did not want to raise me the way she was raised. Okay,
mm-hmm.
that was, and that seemed to be fairly common as I talked to my peers and associates, that there was this turn where I don't know if it was just psychology was just coming into bloom at this point or an awareness, but there seems to be that generation that raised Generation X were like, we are not going to do it the way the previous generation did. We're going to let our children become little flowers and grow up and stuff like that. Do you find that was a common theme during that time?
I think so. I mean, it's funny that we're talking about child psychology back to the 70s. That's when I was born, so
Yeah.
I was a child at that time. So I did have to go back and do some reading. But I do think it's true that certainly recent generations, I'd say definitely since World War II, will say, I'm not going to do the same thing that my parents did. We want to avoid the problems that happened in the past. And psychology was really, I think, moving in a certain direction by the time the 70s came along. And I know when we set this thing up, we were going to talk about from the 70s on to around the millennium. But what an important time to think about mental health since the Beatles broke up in the 70s, right? So
Right.
many parents had to deal with the fallout from that.
They were
But
devastated.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You look
Right.
back on it now, we're still devastated that so much music that could have been made that didn't get done. But late 60s, early 70s was a time when psychology was starting to look at the not the parent-child relationship, but the relationship between mothers and their kids.
Oh,
Because
really? Interesting.
yeah. I mean, it was before the 70s. I want to say it was 68 when Bowlby's book, Attachment and Loss, came out. Now, John Bowlby was a psychoanalyst in England, and he was really interested in the distress that infants feel when they're separated from their mother. And he started looking into this and developing a theory of attachment, which he wanted to call Now, this is something that I've heard. I don't know if it's actually true, but what I've heard is that he wanted to call it the Bowlby effect, but his wife said, no way. It's love is what we're talking about, but no self-respecting scientist would call it the science of love. So he called it attachment. And so attachment theory was born.
That's very interesting. So tell me a little bit about what kind of experiments he did to discover this attachment.
Well, he really started to think about that connection and the notion. You know, he had the theory that infants are born with certain kinds of instincts or behaviors that are all about preserving closeness and preserving contact with the people who are supposed to look after them. You know, the
Okay.
humans develop for so long. Humans are so different from other animals, right? Because we
Right.
developed so long and we're parented for so long, and those childhood years go on for so long. It was really, I think, Mary Ainsworth in the 70s who started to put some experimental procedures in place. Now, Mary, I don't know if you know anything about Mary Ainsworth. She developed a thing called the strange situation.
Okay. Elaborate.
And well, and this was the strange situation was all about figuring out how infants or toddlers are connected to their moms, and they would have they would bring a mom and a child into their lab, which I think was in the basement of the building that they were working in. But they go into the lab and there would be things to play with, and they would observe the infant's behavior with the mother. Then a stranger would come into the room and they would observe the infant's reaction to the stranger. And then the mom would leave and the baby would be alone with the stranger. And then the mom would come back. So they were looking at, you know, what do these babies do in these different, or these toddlers do in these different situations? And what they found was that about 60% of the kids that they looked at were what came to be called securely attached to that parent,
Huh.
meaning that they were upset when the mother left. They
Okay.
had, you know, a stranger comes into the room and they were shy about the stranger, but if the mother was there, they could approach the stranger. But if the mother left, they showed that stranger distress. And when the mom came back, they sought out the mom for comfort. But that was only 60% of the babies that they were studying. Another 20% did not quite react in the same way. They were less securely attached, again, is what it came to be called, and they were resistant. So they were upset when the mom left, but when the mom came back, it was like they were angry with the mother.
Oh, wow.
They were resisting. They were pushing the mom away. And I think lots of parents see this for a little while if they go away on a trip or something, and then they come back and their kids are a bit standoffish and they don't quite know what to do, and they don't know, you know, you get some kids who will just, oh, I'm so excited to see you, I missed you so much, and others who are a little more cautious.
Yeah.
And those kids were, I think she used the term resistant at that time to describe them. And then they had the kids who were avoidant, and these were the kids who the mom left, they didn't seem to care that the mom was
Okay.
gone. And then the mom came back and they were mad at the mom too. So there wasn't any of that closeness that you would see with the kids who are more secure.
So two questions on this. Let me pause you for a second. Do you know why they dropped the influence of the father out in the first place? And then go ahead with that one.
I mean, I think it was the timing that more than anything else, you know,
Just
society at the
feminism was
time.
kind of rising. Feminism was kind of rising.
Well, and who was the primary caregiver for the kids, for the majority of the kids who they would
Right.
be able to bring in for a study? And it was typically the moms. Now they have studied dads more in the years since then.
Okay.
But honestly, dads sort of get short shrift when it comes to parenting,
Right. Right.
for the
Well,
most part.
I was raised by a single mother, so I mean, I kind of understand why they would do that, and I understand that you're dealing in a time where divorce rates are on the rise, and
Mhm.
for the most part, children are going to be going with the mother. I mean, I think that's just a little bit more common. Well, I could be wrong, but I think that's a little bit more common than the children going with the father during that time. I could be mistaken about that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it. more often now you're seeing more of a joint situation where kids are going back and forth, but at the time it would be definitely more common in a single parent situation for it to be the mom. And like I said, there are more researchers now who are interested in the dad's role, and they are seeing some unique roles for dads and some benefits to having a dad in the picture. And that's a relationship that's important too. They've kind of widened out that idea of the connection being to one important adult who's the primary caregiver. So rather than saying the mom, all that research initially was done with moms, but rather than talking about the attachment only to the mom, it could be to another primary caregiver as well.
So did that research then carry into, okay, were there any conclusions, I guess, drawn from that research that would say, yes, this is how the person acts with the mom, but then by extension, this is how this child acts with the dad, or was that just completely left out of that study?
Well, they honestly, they didn't really talk about the dads. What they did talk about was this behavior as being a pattern of relating to other people. So they learn this pattern of secure attachment or avoidant attachment or resistant attachment. They learn that in that first relationship, that primary relationship, but that pattern or attachment style, they would call it, carries over. And at first, there was some, I think, notion that it was sort of unchangeable, but they eventually started, it wasn't until the late 80s, I think, when they started studying attachment in adults. And that's really blossomed into a whole area of psychology and therapy. And they're finding that adults have the same kinds of patterns, but you can change these patterns in a new relationship.
Huh. And did this seem to be sex dependent? I mean, did it matter if the children were boys or girls? Did you still get the same 80, what did you say, 80-20 split? Or
Well, again, there's so little that I was able to grab onto in terms of the research with the dad. So they did have sort of a similar split in terms of adult. Yes, when we're talking about adult attachment styles, it was about a 60-20-20 for those three different styles. And so the idea being that this is a stable pattern, it was sort of still coming up from Hazen and Shaver's work, even in the
no,
late 80s. So
yeah, well,
almost 20 years later.
sorry, I meant the children. Did it matter if the children, like if they were boys, did they seem to be more attached? If they were girls, did they seem, or did that not matter? Was it still that same 80-20 split?
You're asking me a hard question because there hasn't been enough research on that stuff with the dads.
Oh, okay. All right.
The theory is that it works for everybody, and it's something that's internal to the child.
I gotcha.
Is it going to be the same with the moms versus the dads? Is it the same for boys and girls? It wasn't something that in my going back and reviewing that stuff that was as important as kind of the context of the relationship. I mean, they've really built on this over the years, and now there's a psychologist in Vancouver who has a whole institute that's all about the development of these relationships and how relationships are the prime motivator for so much of what kids do.
Does this impact today? So tell me a little bit about when these studies happen that you're talking about right now with this attachment behavior. About when is this going on?
Ainsworth was doing her strange situation experiments in the late 70s. 78, I think, is when she published, and she worked together with Bowlby. And so they wrote some books together. It was the late 80s before they started expanding the notion into adults, and they did. And it might just be the textbooks or it might be my professors, but I remember the connection between Ainsworth and Bowlby's work and Diana Baumrein's parenting styles. That notion that parents have a certain way of interacting with their kids, and the two dimensions that they find that parents vary on are how responsive they are to their kids and how demanding they are, how high their expectations are. With the idea that you're going to create a more secure attachment if you're a parent whose style is authoritative meaning that you're demanding, you have high standards and high expectations for your children, but you're also warm and responsive, and you're explaining to them how to reach those expectations and supporting them in reaching them, as opposed to a more authoritarian parenting style where you're demanding, but there's less of that warmth, there's less of that responsiveness.
That's very interesting. Do you find that people today, like you, so you're in the industry now, and now you're looking back at this, does that filter into how you deal with children today at all, or is this something that's kind of been forgotten, or looked over, or is it just depends on which psychologist you talk to?
It depends a little, maybe, on which psychologist you talk to. I've found that in my work, it's the primary thing. Because I work with kids and I work with families, the relationships that they have are so important.
Mm-hmm.
And how can I can't think of another way to think about or describe relationships other than these ideas of that secure versus insecure attachment, and the importance of warmth and having some standards, right? The psychologist now, Gordon Neufeld is his name, who's kind of building on this theory, looks at stages, the development of those close relationships. And his thinking is that, and he's more in the 2000s, but his thinking is that a huge proportion of your brain and body's alarm system is devoted to detecting when you're apart from the people who are supposed to be looking out for you and looking after you, because we're social animals.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. That's it. That is a very interesting study, and everything you're saying is kind of resonating with me on a personal level as I look back, in my life, because again, I was raised by a single mother who did, she did get married on a couple other times, but for the most part, just her and me, and the attachment that I had there with her, it does affect the rest of my life. It does affect the rest of my relationships, even as an adult, and I can see that. And I'm very thankful that people back then, took the time to study that, so that they can kind of direct people into successful adulthood.
You have to recognize how important, how primary that relationship is, your relationships with your parents. I remember speaking to someone who was probably in her 50s at the time, whose parent passed away, and was just broken up, not only over the fact that she was going to miss her parent, but now she's an orphan at 50, feeling like you're an orphan. Can you imagine how
well, I can.
how hard that is? It's such
Right.
an important connection. Now, can there be other important connections that can replace a parent-child relationship that's not working, or can augment or reduce the negative impact of a parent-child relationship that just isn't lining up properly? Yeah, I think therapists wouldn't have a job if it wasn't possible to create some sort of a corrective experience.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a for sure thing. So we're in the 70s now. Walk me forward a little bit. I have a couple questions. I got one question on the back of my mind, but I do want to know what happened in the 80s and that kind of thing, moving forward. But I do kind of want to know a little bit about B.F. Skinner and whether or not that filtered into any child psychology of that era, or if that was one of those things that just kind of got dismissed with behavioral psychology.
It is such a time, like I was saying at the beginning, there were so many things going on in the early 70s, and it's the context, right, is that they had the moon landing, and all of these things were going on with science, and here's this Harvard professor who says, well, we need a science of behavior. We need a technology of behavior. All of the world's problems are related to problems with behavior, and we have the technology to do something about that. And what he was doing really was sort of building on some work that was done ages ago by Pavlov on classical conditioning. And here comes B.F. Skinner, and he's going to do some research on operant conditioning, meaning that you're doing something, but it's creating some connection. That's how casinos work, right? Is by creating a reinforcement schedule, and you do something, and then every so often something rewarding happens, and that keeps you in the game, so to speak. So Skinner's book,
Beyond Freedom and Dignity,
was 1971, right?
Yeah,
He
right.
didn't believe in free will. He
Yep.
didn't believe in self-determination. He believed that everything that a human did was determined by stimulus that was
By
happening
condition. You're like
outside.
a plant, basically. The plant
Yep,
just kind of
rewards and
grows towards the light. And if you, yeah, so
there's some research now that says that it's even plants have more going on than that. But
yeah, I heard about that. That's crazy. But
so he had this idea that, and my goodness, I don't know if you ever read Walden too, but he had this idea that society would be perfect if we all just fell in line and just respected the fact that there is no such thing as free will, and we should just, follow what's giving us the rewards that we want. Unfortunately, in real life, there are other things. I mean, he might have considered emotions to be nuisance variables, but in real life, there are other things that are happening.
right.
But that being said, at the same time as Skinner was doing his behavioral work, Aaron Beck had developed in the 50s a theory of cognitive psychology, the idea that your thoughts can influence your feelings, and your thoughts can also influence your behavior. Now, B.F. Skinner was having none of that. Anything that went on inside the black box of your mind was not anything he cared about.
Right.
Because it wasn't observable. But Beck was starting to think about, he was starting to think about thoughts, metacognition, I guess you could say. And by the time the 70s rolled around, there was a therapy that was developing, a cognitive therapy. Beck's idea was that if you're depressed, you have these thoughts that are maintaining your depression, negative thoughts about yourself and negative thoughts about the world and negative thoughts about the future. And he called it the cognitive triad. And,
Wow.
and that kind of, over time, that merged with behaviorism and became a cognitive behavioral therapy, where you could do some of those rewards and consequences, and that would shape behavior in a certain direction. But you also need to work on faulty assumptions and thoughts. That therapy was developed with adults in mind. And it sort of filtered down to child psychology.
Okay. All right.
And so they changed the language and started talking about things like worry dragons. I recognize my bias in saying this, but I feel like if you're relying on a child's planning skills and thinking ahead skills, all those frontal lobe connections that aren't yet wired up, if you're relying on your frontal lobe to manage your emotional system, your limbic system, which is very well developed for a 5 or a 6 or a 7-year-old, let's be honest, we've seen the big feelings that those kids have. I mean, you're barking up the wrong tree if you think their frontal lobe is going to manage that other stuff.
Yeah. It's going about it the wrong way. It's looking at it the wrong way.
I mean, that's been my feeling. And yes, you can train a child maybe the same way that you would train a dog to act like there's certain things that they know that they're supposed to do, and there's rules that they're supposed to follow, but it doesn't address the moral development or the ability to solve a problem if a social problem comes up. It doesn't even touch on having empathy for other people.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
it is a situation where if you're relying on those rewards and consequences to motivate behavior, to guide a child to do the right thing, what you're doing is relying on increasing anxiety, separation anxiety primarily. You're increasing anxiety to motivate compliance. And for some kids, that works okay. For other kids, it just creates problems. And they found that kids who were in sort of high-risk families, for example, kids with drug-addicted mothers, this was really having a negative impact on the relationship.
I could imagine that, and that is well said. What you just said, that you're relying on these developmental skills that these children just don't have yet to regulate things that are well developed. It's not going to really work out for you. It's not going to be.
So maybe the active ingredient that creates the change in those cases, because there are lots of therapists that do this. I would say the majority of therapists, it was the way that I was trained. There are lots of therapists that do cognitive behavioral therapy with kids, and they do so effectively, but maybe the active ingredient is the relationship that they form with those kids.
That is always a factor that you have to factor in whenever you're doing any kind of therapy. It's almost like the whole, I don't know, go into the atomic particle theories and stuff like that. But they talk about the fact that the measuring tool, actually they can't really measure it, because actually the measuring tool itself has an effect on the subatomic particles, and so they really don't know where it is when they take the measuring tool away, because the tool itself does. And I think it's the same thing with therapy. With therapy, it's just like the therapist, it's himself or herself, is going to have an impact on the child.
You can't take that. I mean, you can't take that out unless you're doing therapy with a robot or a machine of some kind.
Right. So to push the button, how are you feeling? Good, bad. Okay. Why? Have
That old
robot
Eliza
therapy.
chatbot.
Well, okay. So I actually have to talk about one more thing before we get out of the 70s. And it's actually something that's near and dear to my heart, because I'm actually affiliated with this programming. And I know that was developed during this time, and it was used on kids. And I don't know how much you like it or don't like it, but that's neuro-linguistic programming. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I am a practitioner. I am a certified practitioner in NLP. I used to do weight loss coaching, and actually myself, I lost over 100 pounds myself at one time. And a lot of that was, your psychology related around food. But I know that it was developed in the late 70s with Grinder and Bandler. I forgot. I'm going to mess those names up. But did you read anything about NLP being associated with child psychology at all, or what do you know about that? And your
Years
thoughts
ago.
about NLP in general. And if you disagree with me, that's quite okay. Don't just be yourself. Speak your mind. I want to hear what you have to say.
I mean, years ago, I read about about NLP, and it's not something that I followed up on in any significant way. And looking up some information for today, honestly, my bias is attachment, because I focus on relationships, and I focus on emotional development as well, because I feel like that's part of how are you going to build resilience? It's recognizing what those emotions are trying to tell you. So in terms of the NLP kinds of stuff, I think there are certain sorts of problems that can work well for, and I think you're right. Like eating is one of them. Mm-hmm. The similar kinds of things that you might have used hypnotherapy for would be something that NLP might be effective with. It's not something necessarily that I use with kids or that my colleagues are using with kids, because we're working usually with the parents and with the teachers and with the systems, family systems and the other systems that kids find themselves in, and trying to ensure that those systems are supporting the kids in the development of the skills that they're going to need to face things in their lives.
Yeah. Well, that's super important for sure. I mean, it's one of those things, like you can't just slice the kid out of everything else that they're attached to, whether it be the family or the school system or their religious system or whatever. I mean, it's all integrated. Mm-hmm. So now move us into the 80s. Like here we are in the 80s. What kind of trends started to develop in psychology during that time?
Well, the 80s was the time. I mean, if you look at psychology with kids in the 1980s in the US and even into Canada, what was happening at that time was the satanic panic.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The notion that there were thousands of children who were experiencing satanic ritual abuse, and they were recovering memories of these things as adults, and they were being interviewed by the police and sharing these memories of not only like terrible things, but impossible things that they really did believe. Many of them. I mean, you hear interviews with those kids now, and they felt like they were being pressured by the police to say certain things in certain ways, and maybe it wasn't a real memory, but that was a huge thing that was happening in the 1980s. This idea that there were so many Satanists around in the United States, and that kids were being abused in just incredible ways. You hear those
Now,
stories; they're
I
just
heard that that was largely discredited. That was largely discredited.
absolutely, it was. And one of the ways that it was discredited, or one of the people who did the discrediting, and she had death threats and had to have a security detail. She was a person who had been doing research for ages on the reliability or lack thereof of eyewitness testimony. Elizabeth Loftus is her name.
Okay.
And so Loftus had been doing all this work on how leading questions can lead a person to misremember something, or information that you receive after the fact can lead you to remember an event in a different way. The idea that memory isn't like a snapshot or a movie of what happened, but it's a construction after the fact, and that construction can be changed, was something that Loftus had talked about. And she was involved in some of the trials of some of the adults involved in these satanic cases. Later on, it wasn't until the 90s, it was 95, when Loftus was able to come up with some ideas, some experiments to show that you could create a memory of an entire situation that never actually happened.
Well, how'd she do that?
She was doing, it was called the Lost in the Mall experiment, and she was providing information and using leading questions, like assuming that something had happened, right?
Right.
And asking adults these questions about this thing that happened, a time when they were lost. Their parents lost them in a mall somewhere. The idea was to figure out something that wouldn't cause significant trauma, but would kind of mimic a traumatic memory or a traumatic experience. And honestly, I was able to, before COVID shut everything down years ago, I was able to go to a conference and hear Elizabeth Loftus speak about this, the eyewitness testimony and false memories. And she showed the people in the audience these 3 pictures, and then she shut them down, and she had a few things to say. And then she showed a picture and said, "Was this one of the people you saw 5 minutes ago?" And the whole bunch of us remembered it wrong. And
Yeah.
she found that in about 30% of the people that she interviewed, the experimenters were able to, convince them that this experience, not convince them, but through questioning, they were able to create this false experience.
Yeah, I saw something similar to that one time about in printing false memories, where they had it was with teenagers, and the psychologist was sitting there talking to the teenager and saying, tell me about, and it was slipped in under the radar, but then they said, well, tell me about this time that your mom told you, your mom was telling us about this time you got into a fight with this guy, and it was like totally didn't happen. And then they're like, well, the person was like, well, if my mom said it, it must have happened. I must not remember it. And then at the very beginning, they would say things like, well, I'm not sure about that. And then as they thought about it, they would start to go, yeah, I think maybe I do remember that. It was after school. Yeah, look, I remember this. I grew up in the 80s, and I grew up in an evangelical Christian home. And I remember the Dungeons and Dragons scare, and the celebrating Halloween, and this and that there were all kinds of abuses that happened during Halloween to all these kids, and then of course trends even in that circle kind of go up and down. You hear more about it at different times, but later I heard that again I heard it was largely discredited. I just was like, whoa, I didn't know that. I heard that it was just like a lot of these things, these satanic ritual abuses didn't even happen.
Yeah,
So
exactly right. Yeah, it wound up not being a real thing, and people either recanted their stories, or they certainly weren't able to find any evidence of it. But it's hard to prove a negative, right? It's hard to prove absolutely that something did not happen. And so you had a situation where somebody would say, oh, my father killed this person and buried them at this location, and then there was nothing at the location. And well, obviously that child had been programmed to give you the wrong location, so you couldn't find the body, because all of these people were involved in it.
Well, you can make, what I mean? It's like when you have a theory and you want to justify that theory, no facts really can persuade you of that. It's like the whole thing with I'm sure you've heard this joke before, being a psychologist, the psychologist sitting around with the guy who believes he's dead. And the dead guy says, "No, I'm dead." And the psychologist says, "Well, do dead people bleed?" And the guy thinks about it for a minute and goes, "Well, no, dead people don't bleed." And so the psychologist says, "Well, I'm going to convince him with the facts." So he takes a pin and he sticks him. And the guy goes, "Well, I'll be dead people do bleed." So, sometimes people think that facts persuade, but especially if you have a latched on psychological belief, you're going to arrange those facts in your presuppositions, particularly with psychological presuppositions that someone might have. Now, before we get too far down that rabbit hole, there was some stuff with sexual abuse, as I recall, during that time. There was a movie that happened where it was based on a true story, where a whole family was accused of being predators, and they found out that it was all wrong. That was all leading questions and stuff like that, like you were talking about. Do you remember that? Was that during that time, or?
I mean, part of the issue, I think, that some of the critics of this idea that there was a vast network of satanic abusers was that it was taking attention away, or it was almost discrediting actual reports of real abuse that was actually happening, which obviously that's a serious issue. So that case in particular isn't jumping out at me, but certainly, you were getting these recovered memories from adults in therapy, or recovered, even from kids were recovering memories of things, or believing that they had recovered memories of things. And what they were finding, at least in the satanic situation, is that there were, about 17 or 18 therapists whose patients were making these reports. And so it seemed more likely that it was the person doing the interviews who was kind of prompting something, as opposed to being a widespread kind of an actual issue.
Yeah, yeah, and before I actually would like you to address this other issue too, because I don't want people to think that suppressed memories are altogether unreal. They do happen. Is that correct? They do, suppressed memories are a
Yeah,
thing.
traumatic experiences, right? One of the things, your brain has the ability to protect you from overwhelming stress. And one of the ways it might do that is by making it difficult for you to remember, or impossible for you to remember something that actually happened. You see that with PTSD. And of course, an abusive experience is going to be a traumatic one.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So what else was going on in the 80s during that time? What other were the trends in psychology that were
Oh,
happening?
what were the things that I wanted to talk about in the 80s? Well, a few things were coming up in the 80s. Well, one that is relevant to my work is that Gardner came up with an idea that there are multiple intelligences, that your abilities can't be adequately described by an IQ score. And instead, there are multiple skills that a person could have, where you could be gifted in the verbal way, but maybe not in a mathematical way. And so he defined this long, like, one of the critiques of this was that it was so extensive, but he had this long list of, I think, 18 different kinds of intelligences that included naturalistic intelligence, the ability to identify plants and animals. What Gardner's ideas began to generate was the notion that different kids might benefit from different kinds of teaching or different learning experiences. And now in schools, and maybe your wife has this experience, but now in schools, you're seeing the development of individualized education plans for kids who have some sort of a learning issue. You're seeing, even when you do the IQ tests, and I think I would say the same about many of my colleagues, the IQ score is rarely considered to be the most important thing, or even something necessarily that you talk about. It's the individual strengths and weaknesses within a learning profile that you want to be looking at instead. So that idea of multiple different intelligences, verbal and kinesthetic, and those kinds of things were just kind of beginning in the in the early to mid 80s.
Well, I remember this I have to say, because I had such bad dyslexia, I was tested almost every year in school and went through psychological programs. And one year my IQ test would be high, and one year it would be low, and it was all across the board at different times. But one thing that's interesting is, like, for me personally, they couldn't figure out what my problem was when I was a kid, because they didn't know I couldn't read at first, because I had such a super good memory. I had near eidetic memory, near eidetic. It wasn't eidetic, but somebody could read a book and, like, they'd show the book, and I would be able to recite the book. And so they didn't know that when they gave me another book, like why wasn't he reading? Well, because I'd be able to open a book that they read and pretty much just read it right down the page. So my memory was like off the hook. My memory was acute. Now these days it's not as good as it used to be. But when I was a kid, it was just like, they were like, this kid has one of the best memories we've ever seen. It wasn't, they used to call it photographic. It was not quite photographic, but it was near photographic memory. But I see that. I see that there are kids who are really good. There's a spike in math, and then they don't. But then in reading, it's just like they can't read. And for me, it was like reading was a real challenge for me, but memory was just crazy. And it took them a while to be able to pinpoint. They just thought I was lazy at first. They thought, well, he's just lazy. He's just not doing his work. Of course he can read. But that wasn't the case. I memorized real well, especially auditory. I could memorize things real well, but I couldn't, I had dyslexia. That's basically what it was. It was really hard for me to read. Even to this day, it's still very difficult for me to read. I joke all the time, but I said, look, I only read for information purposes. Don't give me a novel. I'm not going to read it. Very few. I'm not reading for entertainment at all. If it's something I need to know for like a sermon or something like that, I'll read it. But if it's something else, I won't. But that's very interesting. It's kind of interesting because as you're bringing these things up, because as somebody who is, like I said, tested every year, I'm identifying with a lot of what you're saying. So, all right. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but go on.
No, I mean, what you're saying is absolutely one of the reasons why it's so important to do these kinds of assessments with kids who are having trouble at school, right? And in here in Ottawa, many of the psychologists do include some additional memory tests beyond the IQ test when they're testing kids for learning problems. And so something like, if you can hear a story and then repeat it back verbatim, that would come up in the test, and then there might be a little bit more information about, well, why does it look good in the classroom, and he's having a tough time when he's seeing some new stories that he's never seen before.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Okay, so that happened in the 80s. Does that ripple through even to today? Is that still something that is?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few different theories about intelligence, but certainly if you look at modern IQ tests, there's not just an IQ score. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children gives you a verbal reasoning score and a visual spatial score and a flexible or fluid reasoning score and working memory and processing speed. So you get these 5 different abilities that you can look at from the test. And there is even some supplemental things that you can give to find out more information about things like rapid letter naming and stuff like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Was there anything that developed during the 80s that went like quickly the way of the dinosaur, like quickly just was kind of abandoned? Like people were like, somebody who put something out there. You can even bring it up even to the modern time where somebody said, well, this is a theory, and it just got shot down like right away.
Wow, that came up in the 80s. Now you got me thinking. One of the things that was starting to happen in the late 80s and into the 90s, and I think even still today this is going on, was the rise of something called evidence-based practice.
Okay.
Meaning that anything that you were doing, even as a physician, the choices you were making in treatment, as a psychologist, the choices you were making in treatment weren't to be based on your own personal beliefs or experience. They have to be based on scientific evidence. And so that caused a lot of things that people were doing, I think, to, as you say, to kind of go by the wayside a little bit. There was such a focus on that evidence-based treatment when I was doing my doctoral degree, that some of the professors would sort of joke about other approaches that weren't cognitive behavioral therapy. Oh, psychoanalysis was just something that that's for the quacks. That's not anything that we do. That's stuff from the distant past. All that Freudian kinds of, even if it had developed since that time. Anything that wasn't CBT was really, really frowned upon in my training. So it was almost like a religious fervor about this idea that evidence-based. Now, in the last 5 years, 10 years, there's a real crisis in psychology where they're finding all of those studies, even more recent studies that were being done at the time, can't be replicated.
Really? Wow. That
So
says, does that say?
all those findings that this evidence-based treatment is based on, they can't duplicate them. So what's your evidence now?
Yeah, that's always, well, I know in scientific terms, or I should say physical science terms, because I know psychology is a science as well, but in physical science, like if you drop something, you make an experiment and you drop it and it falls, you're supposed to be able to replicate that in other in other situations without too many other variables being accounted for. So I'm sure that that's the same in psychology as well. You should be able to replicate studies. I mean, we didn't change so much psychologically over the past 10 years that it's, you can't replicate those things, right?
Right. I mean, it's a real, like some are calling it a crisis. You can find TED Talks that talk about the reproducibility crisis or the replicability crisis, and it is a major issue in medicine and the social sciences, where the largest group that I found that's looking at replicating previous research is finding that they can only duplicate about 50% of the big major findings from the past.
So what's the conclusion? Is the conclusion that it was fraudulent? Is that the conclusion? I mean, I hate to go there, but
no, I think the conclusion is that that human beings are complicated, and there are more factors than you can account for in most statistical models, I suspect.
Okay. That seems to make sense, because it's just like, look, we're just as unique psychologically as we are unique physically. I mean, just as you can identify somebody's uniqueness unless they're an identical twin, and even an identical twin, there's some differences, and I just think that that's the case, that we are unique in our personality makeup as we are in our physical makeup. You just can't pinpoint that this one therapy is going to work across the board. You have to be a little bit diverse in what you try to apply.
Right, and I think for the most part, professors who are doing research in universities, I mean, you have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of funds to spend on your project, so you can't take 1,000 people from each major city in your state and then make sure that same thing would be true in this state that borders yours, and make sure But these guys. What's it called? Many Labs 2, I think, is the name of the big project. They're going all over the world and gathering subjects and trying to duplicate this stuff. And they're finding it to be challenging, which makes it hard to say that evidence-based treatment is as based in solid evidence as we all wish that it would be.
Interesting.
They do find, I went to a talk, I don't know how long ago it was now, but it was a talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, and what that person, who was a cognitive behavioral therapist and researcher from a big university in the States, who was saying that they find with teenagers, their mental health concerns are quite complicated because it's often more than one thing happening at a time. So the research that you do that analyzes, okay, how does this treatment affect depression? Well, we're only going to have people in the study who are only depressed, and they can't be anxious, and they can't have panic attacks, and they can't have X, Y, and Z. I mean, that's a pretty unique population. If you're talking about teenagers, you're only depressed and not anxious.
Right.
They're having a hard time with real world replication of the kinds of treatment that they're doing. And so again, to me, it points back to the idea of, focus on the environment that they're in and the relationships that they have. I mean, we didn't always have therapists to guide us to make sure that teenagers weren't depressed. There's some sort of a natural process that's meant to occur to allow a person to become a mature, functioning member of society. We don't necessarily need to teach every single person how to be that.
Okay. Well, let's bring us into the 90s, and before we go into the 90s, one question before we go into the 90s here. I have to ask you. This is a hot topic question, and if you don't want to answer it, please just say I'll pass on it. I don't mind. Is there any area in psychology today where you're just like, or even in the past where you're just like, you're just getting it wrong? It's just you're approaching it wrong. Is there a therapy or a psychology where you're just like, look, this this is not going to work. This is really a bad idea.
Well, let me. There's one thing that I can tell you. Now, it's not that I think it's a bad idea, but if somebody proposed this to me, I would say, are you crazy? What are you talking about? How could that possibly work? And that's the eye movement desensitization for the treatment of trauma, which works. We know it works. I have no idea how changing the ways your eyes move and while you're thinking about a traumatic event can reduce the emotions associated with that event. Now, have I gone and done research on EMDR? I haven't. Okay. But just hearing that, okay, you've had a traumatic experience and now you're feeling anxious and you're having nightmares and you're having trouble sleeping. Come into my office and I'm going to make your eyes move and it's going to make it feel better. But it works.
The tapping, the tapping thing that.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. And like I said, I haven't done a lot of reading or research on it. But
that's a little bit of an evolution off of NLP to some degree, because part of what NLP is trying to do is, replace the record that's being, the metaphor is replacing the record that's being played, and to give you a better perspective on what happened. And part of that is to scratch the record. So if you scratch, that's how it was explained to me anyway. So part of it was, now I think people took a piece of that and maybe with some other stuff went forward with that a long way. But that was part of what they taught us at NLP, was to disrupt patterns, so that the person, because they thought that the whole, everything that you do is associated. Like if you looked at a depressed person, you could see their whole body was depressed. So you'd say somebody go into a depression and you'd shake them a little, or you'd tap them, they go, oh, and then it would erase that pattern for just a second. Now think about being depressed, and then you'd erase that pattern for a second. So I don't know if it's true or not either. I do know that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't,
if you can help people, however.
I know that was a loaded question, and I really appreciate you answering it. And I just thought about it. I was like, oh boy, should I ask that question? Because I don't want to get Brian in trouble here. Because I know, like, if somebody listens to this, they're going to call you up, or hey, that's the exact therapy I use, Brian, and you don't know what you're talking about.
I have to recognize my own biases, right? I have a certain way that I do things, and I feel like that's the way that works for me. The way that I do it probably wouldn't work for the therapist down the hall.
Right.
But it matches, the way I work matches with my personality, and for some clients that's helpful, and probably for others it's not as helpful, right? It's the relationship and the fit between the client and the therapist, and the client and the treatment.
Right. So bring us into the 90s here, and maybe we'll have to do a part 2 of this at some point, because this has been a great conversation. We've almost been at it for an hour. I don't know where the time went, quite honestly, but I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the 90s, and then also to talk about how people can reach you. And I know you have a YouTube channel. We'll talk about that, because I really want people to get a hold of that YouTube channel, because you and I both have a similar passion for board games. But before we go there, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we go there, tell me a little bit about the 90s. What sticks out in your head as far as the 90s is concerned?
One really big thing that came up in the early 90s was a book by Thomas Phelan, called 1, 2, 3 Magic.
Okay.
This was a huge event for parenting literature and for I would say for psychologists who used it in their practice, and anyone really who had to work with kids. And it really kind of formalized a timeout process.
Oh, okay.
Right, where you count to 3, that's your child's warning, and then there's some kind of a consequence that's going to come along after that third count. And I remember when my son was born, he was born in 2001. And so once he could start to move around and toddle around a little bit, I remember counting to 3. And he would, he'd be doing something and he'd be watching us like he knew he wasn't supposed to be doing it. I remember he would have his hand in front of the TV screen like he was going to knock over a big TV, or put his fingerprints on my nice TV screen. I don't want that either. But he'd stand there and he'd look, and we'd count 1, 2, and then he'd stop, and then he'd go on about his business. Now, the other fella who was born in 2003, we did exactly the same thing when he was little, and it didn't have any impact on his behavior at all. It just caused problems. I had to chase him down the hall. He'd walk at 2 years old, my son. So this would have been 2005. He's in the other room now. I'm looking over in that direction. At 2 years old, he would be walking into this timeout that we had given him, saying, I've adjusted my attitude.
He was raised by a psychologist. I've adjusted my attitude. How
can you imagine? So for me, that was a
that's like my kids. Well, I don't have any kids, but if my kids, if they said, I've repented now.
Say that.
I've made myself right with Jesus.
Oh my goodness. So I didn't have Jesus to back me up maybe in that circumstance, but at least not overtly. And so he just wasn't interested in this timeout process, and he didn't respond to it at all. It didn't have any impact on his behavior. He would leave a timeout and go right back to whatever he was doing before he went into the timeout. And sometimes I felt like the timeouts were really just so we would feel better. Like there's some sort of it's almost more for the parent than it is for the child. And certainly you could see it being misused, right? But it's another example, those timeouts, it's another example of increasing anxiety to motivate compliance, right? And I had one son who was sensitive to that anxiety, and his response to anxiety was, hey, that's a signal. I recognize it. I'm not going to put myself in that situation, that unsafe situation where something bad might happen. And I had another son who, now he's 17, but when he was younger, anxiety would lead to more silliness instead of controlling his behavior. He wasn't like paying attention to those cues in the way that he needed to. Right? So that 1, 2, 3 magic was huge. It was something that was recommended by therapists. I heard about it in my training. It was a book that was put in my hand when I was doing my PhD. And it was everywhere. I mean, they had Super Nanny was a TV show that was on in the 2000s. And it was all about that, the naughty carpet that you would send kids to when they were being bad. Withdraw attention and withdraw your love if the behavior's not appropriate. Now I think there are more psychologists who are sort of saying, well, okay, that might be better than spanking, but others are saying it's no different from spanking.
Yeah.
It doesn't physically hurt the child, but the emotional pain is the same. If you look at a brain scan, the emotional pain is somehow similar. And it doesn't teach the child the skill that they need to get through that situation. What did my second child need to stop him from doing that behavior, right? And who needed to learn something? I've put you in timeout 100 times for this behavior and you're still doing it. Which one of us needed to learn something, right? It was this guy, not him. Later on in the late 90s was Ross Greene's book, The Explosive Child, which started this idea, which began with this idea. I think I remember this from the front title page. The idea that children will do well if they can. A philosophy that kids will do the right thing and make the right choices if they're in a situation where their skills can match the situation. And if they're not doing well, then there's some skill that hasn't developed yet that maybe they need to work on.
Right.
And so it becomes then more about problem solving than about consequences and punishment.
Oh, well, that's interesting. That's certainly interesting.
Right.
One last final question, and that is, if there is, well, I hate to boil it down to one thing, but If you could give your maybe top 3 pieces of advice, or even top 1 piece, or however you want to phrase it, to parents today who are dealing with a difficult child, what would it be?
Okay, wow. So very, very generally, of course, because you can't
Yeah,
speak to unique situations when in on a show like this. But I would say number one, like help is out there,
right.
right? You don't have to deal with a child who's having trouble all by yourself. You you may be able to find a
Well, unfortunately, our internet connection got disconnected. We were really about done with the interview, other than the fact that I wanted to give Brian an opportunity to tell you where to find him on the internet and ways you can support him. But he's not here to do that because the internet connection went down, as I already said. So I'm going to go ahead and let you know how you can find him. He has a YouTube channel, and this is actually how we met, because he has a YouTube channel called Brains on Games, and he also has a Facebook page by that same channel. So if you want to go over there, and he talks about like best games to play with your child and helping children grow through games. But he also talks about games in general too. He doesn't just talk about child psychology and games, but show him some respect and show him some gratitude, or whatever you want to call it, and go on over there and like his channel, and like the Facebook page. I'll provide links for both of them in the description below. And also, if you like what we're doing here, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share. And if you're listening to this on podcast form, leave us an honest review and share it on your favorite social media. And always remember that we do have a YouTube page. And also, if you want to go that one extra step, we do have a Buy Me a Coffee account, which is like an alternative to Patreon, where you can actually donate money, where if you want to see us upgrade to some better equipment, a better studio, and all that stuff, every little bit helps. I would really appreciate if you went on over there and make a donation if you are so inclined. Until then, I am Ian C., and this has been some Cereal for Dinner podcast, and we will catch you on the next episode. Hey everyone, I just wanted to thank you once again for listening or watching this, either on MP3 on the podcast or in YouTube, and remind you that if you're only listening to this on podcast form, that we do have a YouTube page, and we have some video exclusive content over there. And if you're already on YouTube watching this, if you like this video, you also might like these videos.